Hello. I thought for today's video we could talk a little about apotropaic iron when it comes to fairies and some terms that are sometimes misunderstood when it comes to using iron as protection against fairies, and another sort of common, I don't know if you want to call it a misunderstanding or maybe misinterpretation of folklore that I'm seeing more and more often in particularly the pagan community, but sort of out there in general. And today's video is sort of based on something that I had written recently on social media. I thought I would turn it into a video. Maybe that would be a good way to get the information out there to a wider audience. So, whenever you look at what is sort of the most commonly recommended protection for fairies, if you're having an issue with them, if you're in a situation where you could potentially be around the more malicious ones, or you have them harassing you, bothering you, taking your stuff, you're going out on a night that's reputed to have more dangerous activity, any of those things, you yourself fall into one of the demographics that's more at risk to be bothered by them or potentially taken by them, which would include, actually it's pretty wide range, newborns, nursing mothers, women who have just given birth in general, actually people who have just given birth in general, new brides, musicians, midwives, generally attractive people. Anyone who sort of fits into any of those categories was usually considered someone who'd be more attractive, if you will, to fairy attentions, potentially of the more dangerous kind. And of course, if you're going somewhere that is known to have more dangerous fairy activity, if you're out on Belchina or Samhain, Midsummer and the winter solstice also have some more dangerous activity associated with them, or at least an uptick in activity in the case of Midsummer. So any of these demographics or times can be known to have more dangerous activity where you might want to have a little bit of protection. Anytime we're talking about protection and fairies, pretty much the first thing that's going to be recommended in the folklore, in modern communities in general, is going to be iron. Why? We don't really know. The truth of the matter is, it's one of those things that's been recommended for so long, so consistently across so many traditional communities, generally in the Celtic-speaking countries, but also in some cases outside of those, that there really is no clear explanation for why iron is a good protection against them. You will see some really strange theories for why iron. I have to be honest, I'm pretty skeptical of a lot of the theories that float around. Some of them come from the Victorian era and that sort of strata of folklorist where you could just make something wacky up and throw it out there and people would accept it. And I'm not a huge fan really of any of the theories that say that fairies are afraid of iron because fairies are actually Neolithic or Bronze Age people who survived somehow and became magical beings. That is one theory that is out there. There is also the theory that fairies are the human dead from those periods who have this sort of bitter resentment at iron because it came in with the Iron Age peoples and sort of subjugated them. That's not really how history worked. If you study how iron as a metal came in culturally, and how the Iron Age replaced the Bronze Age, it really wasn't like human beings discovered how to work iron and suddenly every human in the culture that had discovered iron had an iron weapon and just went rampaging and destroying bronze cultures. I'm sorry, it sounds kind of like a video game when you say it that way. When iron was initially discovered as something that could be worked and turned into weapons, it took a while for that to really become a major thing in the cultures. It was also sort of a weapon of the elite. It was expensive. It was a specialty item for blacksmiths to do. You wouldn't have had armies wielding iron, at least not for quite a while in these cultures. There have also been different people who still work with bronze today who have shown that bronze weapons could hold their own against iron weapons. Both types of metal have different pros and cons for why one would be considered superior in certain cases versus the other. So it's really not just this simplistic, some groups of humans learned how to work iron and then they all were running around with iron swords and just destroyed these more primitive, I also hate the word primitive, I hate a lot of words and I do air quotes when I say them, I hate the word primitive, more primitive bronze wielding cultures. So the idea that the human dead from Neolithic or bronze cultures that may have become fairies in some specific circumstances would have this deep-seated resentment towards iron and for some reason then fear it enough that they would just flee anytime it was around. To me, I just don't agree with that theory. Your mileage may vary, as they say. It is a theory that's out there. Another theory that's out there is that iron, because it's a worked metal, and blacksmiths are renowned for being these sort of magical people, the magic that comes with metalworking would have imbued the iron with power. Iron itself just has this sort of reputation for being a holy metal. The word iron, if you trace it back etymologically, relates to the concept of holiness and sacredness. I don't have it written down, of course, because that would have required too much planning. But if you search it, Google can be your best friend here. You'll find out that that's sort of the root of the word for iron. So I think that there's a deeper connection here with this particular metal and this particular concept. My own personal theory, and this is all just different personal theories, you can agree with them or not agree with them, however you choose. My own personal theory is that iron by its nature is a very grounding metal, whereas other metals are more conductive and conducive not only to electricity but also to magical energy. Iron really is not, and I think that has more to do with it. That probably their aversion to iron has to do with the fact that their magic just doesn't work very well around it. And obviously, if you're an otherworldly being who relies on magic and magical power to do a lot of what you do, and you're around a metal that negates that power, it's not going to be your favorite thing. There is also sort of this newer idea that I've seen, which I'm just going to say I have no opinion on, that it might have been something as simple as a literal allergy, that they might have physically not been able to stand being around metallic iron, kind of the same way that some humans are allergic to nickel. I'm just going to say I have no personal opinion on that theory. But those are some of the theories that go around as to why the other crowd doesn't like iron. I do also want to be very clear that while you will see iron recommended as like the go-to protection against fairy beings, not just the most dangerous ones, but in general, not all otherworldly beings are averse to iron. There are quite a few, even some of the really dangerous ones, who are not at all bothered by it. red caps, who are a type of English goblin spirit that are known to kill people. They dye their hats red with human blood. Very festive. They have no issue with iron. Their shoes are actually supposed to be either made of iron or tipped with iron. Iron will do nothing to them. There are other things you have to look to for protection against red caps. Generally, hearth spirits and mine spirits are not bothered by iron. So if you have a brownie, for example, in your home that becomes a boggart, which is one thing that some folklore says will happen if brownies are angered, iron is not going to be very effective against them, according to some folklore. Mine spirits, kobolds in Germany, knockers, any spirit that is sort of coming from or native to the deep earth and mining, not going to be bothered by iron. So yes, it is the main go-to protection, and it is something you want to keep in mind, but understand that it is not 100% effective against 100% of the otherworldly beings that are out there. It's still your main go-to though, but just don't expect it to be 100% good against everything you might run across. That is important to keep in mind. The main secondary recommendation is generally salt, and then after salt you have sort of a plethora of other options, if you will. So that sort of covers the basics of iron in general. When we're looking at what sort of iron, really any iron object. You will see some sources, particularly the more modern sources, talking by modern sources meaning like more neo-pagan books that are overly specific, I guess I'll say, in what sort of iron you need. But if you look at the older folklore, if you go back to the older sources and the anecdotal material, you will see the use of iron in pretty much any form. You will see iron fire pokers, iron tongs, iron nails, iron scissors, iron crosses, iron church bells. Church bells, in fairness, are also kind of another topic in and of themselves. Iron knives, iron swords. Really, the larger message is just that it needs to be an iron object. In some cases, you'll just see recommended carry some iron in your pocket. And the implication there is that it really doesn't matter what form the item takes as long as it's iron. I do also want to clear up something that is a very common misconception that I see today. Because the older sources generally specify iron, yes, steel also works. Steel is usually, if I remember this correctly, between 90 and 98% iron. It's just alloyed with a couple other metals to usually make it more resistant to rust and corrosion, to make it stronger, shinier, and various other additional properties. But it is still mainly iron. It's just called steel because of the alloys that are worked into it, and some of the other things that go into the process of making it, but it's still mostly iron. So when we talk about protections against fairies and people emphasize iron so much, I have seen people get confused and think that you have to go find some sort of antique, genuine iron item. Steel works just as fine, just as well. There we go. Sorry, steel works fine, just as well. Keep in mind that we actually have a great deal of steel and iron items around us pretty much every day. Most silverware, putting it in quotations for a reason here, most silverware is actually steel, stainless steel. We have a lot of stuff that is stainless steel because it's fairly inexpensive to manufacture, and again, it's resistant to corrosion and rust, and it's fairly durable, and it's fairly strong. So yes, in a pinch you could use the spoons or forks or knives out of your kitchen drawer as protection against the good folk if you really needed to. Most cookware is steel, sometimes coated with other things. We have a lot of steel around us that we don't often realize is there, but it is. So, don't assume things are steel. Sometimes you'll be surprised that something isn't that you think would be, but a lot of things are that you might not think would be. So, something to keep in mind. And yes, steel works just as well as iron. It doesn't have to be 100% pure iron. Even historically, iron was very rarely 100% pure iron. It actually gets very brittle when it's 100% pure in a worked form. So it's almost always had other stuff involved in it. Another thing that I see people getting confused about on a regular basis is the concept of cold iron. Cold iron is a term, it's now sort of an archaic term, but it's a term that we used to see that refers specifically to edged or bladed weapons made from iron. So knives, swords, some people include scissors because they are sharp and have blades. But when we talk about cold iron, we're talking effectively about iron weapons. In modern contexts, guns are also considered cold iron. You see this in more updated language with the term cold steel. Same idea. So when you see people talking about cold iron or cold steel, it just means an edged or bladed weapon made of iron, or guns. I don't know enough about bullets to really get into that, but if it's a bullet made of iron or steel, that would also fall into this category, I would assume. So, just so we're all clear on exactly what cold iron and cold steel mean, you will see that recommended sometimes in the older material for protective purposes. In that case, you sort of have that double energy. Not only is it the iron and the steel, but you're also using a weapon, so it's protective in two senses. There we go. Now, the final thing that I wanted to touch on quickly before we wrap up the topic of iron and its protective properties, something that I'm seeing more and more, and I've seen this in several places now as an issue raised by different people, either as a question or just a statement, the idea of human blood having protective qualities against the Fae. I want to say initially, just to immediately get this out of the way, that is not true. There are many different types of fairy beings that feed on human blood. Throughout folklore, you have beings like Kelpies, Agaski, Lananshi, the aforementioned redcaps, different beings who, hags as well, who are directly predatory towards humans. And clearly blood, not a factor that's going to protect you in any way. There's also a long history, which I mentioned in my earlier video on fairies and sex, of fairies and humans having sexual relations and interbreeding and having children. So clearly human blood not going to have any effect in keeping fairies away or driving fairies away or protecting against them. The main concept that I see behind this idea is people arguing that human blood has iron in it, therefore, because iron is protective from fairies, fairies will stay away from it. Okay, let's dissect this really quickly. First of all, chemically speaking, the iron that's in the human body is not the same as the iron that's in iron ore or worked steel or worked iron that we would find in weapons. And I think that is an important detail. There's even some argument among some people as to whether iron ore, unworked iron ore, will work as protection against fairies or not. I tend to think that it will. This would include hematite, magnetite, anything that can be processed into iron. Other people argue that it won't. However, those are still chemically very similar to worked iron. The iron that you find in the human body chemically is significantly more different than the iron that you find in the ground, or you would find in a steel spoon or a nail. Another thing to keep in mind, besides all that which is significant, we're talking about the iron in the human body, by the way, we're talking mostly about hemoglobin, ferritin. It is important for the human body, that's how your blood transports oxygen around, so you do need it. But it's not just iron in a pure form. It's a specific kind of iron, and I do think that matters. This is just my opinion. But another thing to keep in mind, I have visual aids for this, the amount of iron in an average adult, larger human, let's say 6 feet tall, 200 pounds, the amount of iron in the entire body is equivalent to a teaspoon. It's 4 grams. And if that's not enough of a visual aid, I have more. It's roughly equivalent to this much. So, hoping you can see how little that actually is. And it doesn't look like too much. It's a very, very tiny amount. You're talking about 4 grams of chemically processed iron in the entire body. Children would have about half of this, or less, depending on the age and size of the child. So, it's a very tiny amount throughout the entire body. A little bit of blood is going to have really a microscopic amount of iron in it. Now, where did this come from? Basically, there are some anecdotes that say, first of all, that fairies have white blood, not red. And secondly, that some fairies are averse to or driven off by the color red. Now, keep in mind that that particular information, although it does appear in some anecdotes from Ireland, you can find it again in the book The Good People, and I believe it might also be mentioned in the Celtic, Fairy Faith in Celtic countries. The idea behind the white blood and the aversion to the red blood is directly linked to modern Catholic beliefs relating to fairies, and the idea that fairies are denied the ultimate salvation of going to heaven, and that a sign of that is that they don't have red blood, that their blood is white, and that because of that they have this sort of jealousy of red human blood, because that indicates that humans can be saved and can go to heaven. That's where that whole idea comes from. So, and it's also something that we only see in a few very specific anecdotes, whereas we have the bulk of other material which talks again about predatory fairies who eat humans or drink blood or dye their clothes in blood, and also about fairies who specifically wear the color red. Red shoes, red dresses, red hats. So it's clear in the wider material that the color red does not bother the majority of them, and that human blood does not bother the majority of them. It's this very specific, particularly Catholic belief relating to the idea of fairies and salvation. So, that is kind of where we're at with fairies and iron, and cold iron, and human blood. If you need protection against fairies, horseshoe over the door works, an iron nail, carrying any iron items is a good way to go. In the next video, I will touch a little more on the connection between fairies and the dead, human dead, and try to clarify that a bit. That's a huge topic, and I can't do that really in a short video. But hopefully this clears up a little about the use of iron in an apotropaic sense, and also some of the common misconceptions relating to iron and its different uses in conjunction with fairies. So I hope you all enjoyed this and found it educational, or at least moderately entertaining. I will see you next time.